Hi, so for my trade book review, I chose Farewell to Manzanar, and I would like to start off with a quote in the book that I really thought embodied one of the main ideas of this book. She said, "I smiled and sat down, suddenly aware of what being of Japanese ancestry was going to be like. I wouldn't be faced with physical attack or even overt shows of hatred. Rather, I would be seen as someone foreign or as someone other than American, or perhaps not be seen at all." So as I mentioned, the book is Farewell to Manzanar, written by James D. Houston and Jane Wakatsuki Houston. It's a biography and a memoir of Jane Wakatsuki and her family's experience of before, during, and after their experience of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So a quick summary of the book. The book starts off with the news of the Pearl Harbor bombing on December 7th, 1941. The news reaches Jean and her family, where her father is arrested and her mother moved the family to a Japanese ghetto on Terminal Island and into Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. Just a few months later, in February of 1942, President Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 9066, and just a month later, Jean's family is ordered to move to the relocation center in Manzanar. It's important to note that Jean was only 7 at the time, and since she was born in the United States, she was an American citizen like many other Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at the time. So they arrived to the camp with awful living conditions. She recalls the sight of the unfinished barracks with dust everywhere, poorly cooked food, lack of warm clothes, and unpartitioned bathrooms. But eventually throughout the book, Jean and her siblings eventually do adjust to that camp life. Jean explores different religion and hobbies. She's very intrigued by Catholicism, which her father opposes greatly because it goes against Japanese tradition. And she also explores a lot of different hobbies, some that were traditionally Japanese and some American. But eventually she finds comfort in baton twirling. And on the other hand, Papa struggles with this new life after he came back from the detention camp, where he was aggressively interrogated and accused for being a traitor. He comes back violent, distant, and he basically spirals down into alcoholism. And throughout the book, you can kind of see his struggle with his loyalty to both his Japanese and American ancestry. The most symbolic part of this struggle is when he is issued a loyalty oath to the United States, and although he answers yes and pledges loyalty to the United States, Jean later overhears him singing the Japanese national anthem to himself. Just a few years later, the camps are closing down after the Supreme Court eventually ruled that the camp policy is illegal, and by December of 1944, Jean's family moved back to Long Beach in California, and at her new school, she experiences prejudice and racism, but not so much in the violent way that she feared, but in a much more subtle way where she feels invisible and unaccepted, and that's where that quote comes from. So she struggles through school, through middle and high school, almost to the point of dropping out until her senior year of high school when her family moved to San Jose. There she regained her confidence and finds a way to fit in, and she was even nominated as the queen of their spring carnival. And at the election assembly, she wears this exotic-looking sarong and wears her hair down with a flower in her hair. And despite her teachers trying to prevent her from winning, she wins by a landslide. Her father gets really upset by this, by her winning. He calls it by flaunting her sexuality and trying to win the votes of white boys. And so as a compromise, she wears a very conservative dress to the coronation ceremony. There she realizes that neither the revealing dress, which is symbolic of her American identity, nor the conservative dress, which is symbolic of her Japanese identity, really represents her true self. And in the last chapter of the book is her, a few decades later, in April of 1972, she goes back to visit Manzanar with her husband and her 11-year-old daughter, which is the age that she was when she left the camp. When she goes, she recalls the memories of her time there, and she's finally able to make peace with her experience and how it really shaped her identity as a Japanese American. There are a lot of connections that can be made from this book. Here's just a few examples. Of course, the Executive Order 9066 and the struggles of Japanese American families when they had to move. They essentially had less than a week from when the order was issued to when they had to be ready to go, get rid of all their property, sell as much as they can. And from there, we can kind of connect it to the role of government in a time of war and ask the question, was this justified? Was this the right thing to do for the United States at the time? And then, of course, the incarceration camp itself. This book shows a great example of the destructive effect that the camps had on Japanese American families, as well as the poor conditions of the camps that they had to endure. And again, we can bring this back to, was this justified? There's also some court cases that we can bring into the lesson, some of the most famous being Hirabayashi versus United States and Korematsu versus United States. And we can compare their experiences to the experience that Jean and her family had in the book. Another connection that can be made is the loyalty oath and the military draft within the incarceration camp, and the irony of how the United States government first deemed Japanese Americans as threats and, incarcerated them without due process, and just a few years later, drafted them into the military as a guise and said that this is a way to show loyalty to the United States. And because Woody, Jean's brother, joins the 442nd Regiment, a connection can also be made to that, as well as other segregated units during World War II. There's also the topic of racial prejudice and discrimination, maybe the prejudice against Asian Americans leading up to World War II with the Asian Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, as well as the differences of internment of German and Italian citizens versus Japanese American citizens. And finally, the topic and issue of identity, which isn't necessarily a historical topic, but I think a topic that's important and needs to be addressed nonetheless. Just the topic of and the connection with struggles of racial identity in adolescence, and Jean's journey of her discovery of her own identity throughout the book. Finally, I do really highly recommend this book to be used in a classroom. It can be used probably in 10th grade world history or 11th grade U.S. history. It could be used in 8th grade U.S. history, although the text might be a little bit too difficult for middle schoolers, so I would recommend scaffolding or maybe just using select chapters. With that being said, this can be used as an entire book if the unit is long enough and there's time for it, or the teachers can use select chapters that really encaptures a certain topic that they want to cover in class. As I mentioned before, there are multiple connections that can be made from this book to a history class, many historical events, the topic of racism, stereotypes, and prejudice, as well as identity development. So that's it. Thank you.